Are you looking to move and wondering, should I live in the city or should I live in the country? Curious what country living is like versus city living? If so, you're in the right place because today I'm going to be breaking down the pros and cons of both living in the country versus living in the city so you guys can make the best choice when deciding where to relocate. If you're new to the channel, guys, please go ahead and smash that subscribe button, hit the notification bell, hit the like. Really appreciate it. Without further ado, let's get right into it. Okay, so first I want to talk about country living. Now, as someone who grew up in the country on 14 acres their whole life, I know a thing or two about living in the country. I mean, where I grew up, the only internet you could get was HughesNet, so take that for what you will. And despite the lack of Wi-Fi and internet, it's pretty great. So let's first go into the pros, and then we'll discuss the cons of living in the country. Alrighty guys, so the first pro we're going to talk about, and probably the most obvious one, is the peace and quiet of living in the country. Now, when you're living in the country and your neighbor's house is, 300 yards away, 200, 100 yards away, it's generally a lot more quiet and peaceful. I mean, on top of that, you're not going to have construction. The traffic's going to be a lot less. I mean, overall, it's just going to be a lot more quiet and serene. And for a lot of people, that's important, you go home to relax, to unwind. You don't want to hear a construction crew with a jackhammer. You don't want to hear your neighbors throwing a party. You don't want to hear your neighbor's dog, and I can definitely understand that and appreciate that. So that's definitely a big thing with living in the country, guys, is the general serenity and peacefulness you get with being a little bit more isolated. Now, the second thing I want to talk about, and this is kind of more of a personal experience, but I find it to be generally true across the board, is the sense of community you get when living more in the countryside. Now, I remember when our neighbors would go on vacation, they would literally have us come stay in their home to take care of their animals, take care of their house, whatever. There's just a lot more sense of trust and community when it comes to living out in the countryside, at least from my experience. Kind of like I got your back, you got my back kind of thing. We would all watch out for each other. Anytime anyone was going on vacation, anytime anyone needed anything. Around the holidays, everyone would always bake up a big plate and pass it around the community. And I'm not saying you can't get that in the city. I typically find that everyone kind of sticks to their self in the city, more as when you're in the country, there's kind of this sense of community that is really refreshing for some people. So number 3 I want to talk about, and I already kind of mentioned it before, but less traffic. Now, when you're living on a back road, a dirt road, you're on a county line, there's going to be a lot less traffic. Not only is that going to create more noise, having more traffic, if you have kids and they're playing in the road, or you have dogs, I'm not saying your dogs and kids are probably going to be playing in the road, but stuff happens, right? And it's just kind of nice having that security that, hey, my road is only 30 miles per hour speed limit and maybe 5 cars pass through here a day. Generally be a lot safer for kids and animals and whatnot, obviously due to just having less traffic, less risk. There's less chances of a car coming through and hitting something in the road that shouldn't be there. All right, number 4 I want to talk about, guys. If you like to shoot guns, you like to hunt, you like to have bonfires, campfires, you like to ride, 4-wheelers, UTVs, all that good stuff, you obviously really can't do that if you're living in the city. Now, I do realize there is some neighborhoods that do allow for some fires here and there with certain restrictions, but generally it's going to be a lot more easygoing in the country. It's your land, you can kind of do whatever you want to do. Obviously there's certain restrictions, you can't break the law. There is that general sense of, hey, this is my land, I'm the captain here, I'm going to do what I want to do because I bought and paid for this land. That's kind of the whole essence of all the pros of living in the country. It's kind of just that sense of natural freedom that you get with living out there. All right, guys, the last thing I want to talk about real quick is just, obviously, if you're into having animals, your dogs, cats, but then you get into, horses, cows, alpacas, chickens, you can do all that in the country, So if you're looking down the road and you're saying, hey, I'm going to want livestock, I'm going to want my own chickens, I want my dogs to be able to run around the yard and not have to worry about keeping them in a cage all day. That's what you can get with living in the country. You get a lot more And it kind of goes back to that same point. You get a lot more freedom on what you can and cannot have on your property versus if you're in the city. Alrighty guys, now let's talk about the cons of living in the country. Now, I know I already kind of mentioned this first one before, and this isn't everywhere, but this is pretty generally. If you're living way out in the country or even in the country a little bit outside of town, you're not going to be able to get access to the same internet as of now. You know, obviously all the time you see more and more crews land the fiber lines and whatnot on county lines and on back roads, but as of now, you know, there's still a lot of country space that doesn't have very good internet. So, you know, if it's really important to you to have super fast speeds for streaming, for video games, for your work, you're definitely going to want to keep that in mind because it only gets so good in the country. And like I said, obviously there's going to be exceptions to this. There's plenty of people I know that live out in the country and they have pretty good internet, but it's just not going to be like when you're right in town and you have fiber optic cables and you're running 1,000 Mbps per minute or whatever. So definitely keep that in mind. If you need fast internet speeds, you're definitely going to want to consider that. Alright guys, I think this is the biggest con. Number 2, you're going to have to drive farther to your job, to the grocery store, to go get food, to the gym, whatever you want to do. Typically, you're going to have to drive a lot farther to get to those things. And, you know, if you're living in a city, depending on where you live, you might be able to walk down the street to go out to eat. You know, you might be able to walk down the street and go to the gym. You might be able to walk down the street and go to the grocery store real quick. It doesn't have to be this big thing where you drive 20 minutes there and 20 minutes back like it can be in the country. You know, I remember where I lived, the nearest big city, you know, Fort Wayne. I lived in Corona. You know, it'd take me 45 minutes to get to the gym, you know, a good gym, and I'd have to drive 45 minutes back. You know, that's an hour and a half right there. Then you work out for a couple hours. I mean, I would spend 3 hours minimum, you know, just going to the gym because of the drive that I had to make to get to the gym. So that's a big con of living in the country, guys, is just simply having to transport yourself to wherever you need to go. Typically, it's going to be more of a hassle than if you're right in town. All right, number 3, you guys, and a lot of people, this is kind of a hidden con, is you're living out in the country, and especially, you know, you might not have to worry about this if you're way out west or in an area where you don't have inclement weather. If you're living out in the country and a huge snowstorm hits, you're going to be one of the last people that the county gets to clear you out. You know, if you get 6 or 7 inches of snow, you're not going to be able to, the plow truck and salt truck, you're going to be the last on their priority list to get the roads cleared. So unless you have a really good truck, an all-wheel drive car, something similar, you definitely have to consider this, especially if you go to work early in the morning and the county hasn't got to you, and you know there's 5 inches of snow on your road, but everyone else that's living in town is cleared. You got to think about that. You know, I remember plenty of times driving home and it'd be perfectly fine on the highways, and then I'd get to my road where I lived to drive through inches and inches of snow. Like some of the most hardcore driving I ever did was doing that, you know, just simply because the county hadn't got there because they were too busy plowing out the city where everyone else is actually driving. All right, last con we're going to talk about, guys, is typically it's going to cost you more to acquire land and maintenance your yard. And with that, home values can kind of be unpredictable. Now, if you're buying into an addition, you know, in a city or a town, you got 10 houses right next to each other, you know, 50 houses within the proximity. There's other 3-bed, 2 baths, there's other 4-bed, 2 baths. You're going to get a pretty good idea on what the market is dictating for that home. Now, when you're out in the country and, you know, you have 15 acres out there and there's no reputable comps, it's going to be kind of hard to determine, you know, what this property is actually valued at and what I should be paying for it. So that's kind of up in the air with the country, guys, is there's not going to be an extremely predictable market value for your properties. Obviously, you can get close, but it's not nearly the same as if you're in a city or a town where you can get in real close proximity to what that is actually selling for. And with that, like I mentioned, you got a couple acres, you got 6-acre yard, whatnot, you're gonna need a good mower. you're gonna need, a good chainsaw to take care of brush and whatnot. You're gonna have to think about these things. You can't just, it's not like living in a condo unit where an HOA takes care of all your landscape and the drive and all that stuff. When you're in the country, you gotta plow your own driveway. You gotta mow a big lawn. You gotta take care of trees that fall down in your yard. That's all on you, and all that costs money, and all that needs equipment to operate and do. All right, you guys, now let's discuss what it's like living in the city. Now, obviously, some of these are gonna be mirrored off of the pros and cons from living in the country, but I think there's some good exceptions here and some key distinctions that we can discuss, so let's get right into it. All right, you guys, like we mentioned with pros, obviously you're going to have a lot faster access to, your amenities, your grocery store, restaurants, gyms, whatnot, and you're going to be probably a lot closer to a job and other opportunities. That's the real big key with living in the city, guys. Depending on what business you're doing, obviously there's caveats to everything, right? But in general, living in the city, you're going to have I love the saying, the more hands you shake, the more money you make. If you're living and always hanging out in 15 acres and you're in the middle of nowhere, how many hands are you really shaking? You have to think about that, guys. The opportunity in a city is very grand, especially if you're looking to do business, some sort of service, any business really, service-based, you're selling a product, brick and mortar. You're gonna need to be in this city, guys, to have more opportunity, to meet more people, to actually make more money and be successful. So that's a big thing with living in the city, guys, is there is a lot more people and a lot more opportunity for jobs, careers, business opportunities, all that stuff. So if that's important to you, definitely a huge thing to consider, because obviously, as you guys know, your business, your career, your money, that's going to kind of be the flagship on what you, for most people at least, for how the rest of your choices are made. And like I mentioned before, obviously if you're living in the city, you're going to have a lot better internet speeds. You're going to have a lot better service. That's the thing I didn't mention. If you're way out in the boonies, yeah, sure, you might be able to get some Wi-Fi or whatnot, but your service for calls and texts might be garbage. I know where I lived, it was garbage. You couldn't really call people without having it break up or fail or whatnot. So again, if your job or you require your phone to be used a lot, that's going to be an issue, guys. If you're in bad service, that's really going to hinder you. And I know it hindered me a lot. That's literally a huge reason why I moved out of the country and moved to the city, was simply because I need good internet. I need more people to talk to. These are really important things, and I think it's important that we discuss that so you guys can make a good choice on whether or not you should live in the country or the city. And I know I mentioned that there's a good sense of community when living in the country, but that's not always true. And there's lots of cases where you could move in a good community and become best friends, very close friends with your neighbors, with your community. I'm not saying that's exclusive to only country living. If you get in a good neighborhood, a good community where everyone's hitting it off, you can probably actually make more friends and have a better community, more opportunity to talk to more people and to connect with more people. I'm not saying that living in the country is the only way to connect with other people. It's just that general serene vibe that you get when living out in the country that you typically don't get when living in the city. All right, you guys, the other two things I want to mention with pros living in the city, and these are kind of mirrored off the country living, so bear with me here, but it's obviously typically going to be cheaper and less maintenance to upkeep, as well as your value of your home is going to be very predictable, like we talked about before. All right, you guys, let's discuss the cons real quick of living in the city. Obviously, number one is it's very noisy. It's way less peaceful in the city. You're going to deal with honking horns. You're going to deal with police sirens, trains, construction, heavy traffic. All of that you're going to deal with when living in the city. It's going to be way more noisy. If you're someone that really values that peacefulness when you get home, you might want to consider that, because although there is more opportunity, there's all that good stuff about living in the city. There's something to be said about peace of mind and having peace when you're actually at your home. No one wants to work 10 hours and come home and hear the neighbors partying it up and their dog barking and police sirens going down the road. Like, that isn't ideal, obviously, but there's pros, and it all weighs out. And Really, guys, in this video, it's important that you ask yourself, what's important to me? Because that's really where all this leads. It's here's the pros of this, here's the cons. It all weighs out, and really the most important thing is what is important to me? What do I value? And that's really going to determine whether living in the country or living in the city is going to be the right choice for you. And obviously, guys, when you're living in the city, you're going to have to deal with higher crime. Now, obviously, this depends on your area, but you're going to have to deal with things, not just crime, there's going to be way more car crashes around your area. There's going to be, break-ins, run-ins with the police, where, there's going to be busts and whatnot. And obviously, that depends on the area that you live in, but that's something to consider. That happens if you're in B or C class neighborhood. That's not even necessarily bad. There's just way more people in a given area, so there's obviously going to be a way higher chance that there's going to be some sort of crime or some sort of disturbance with the police. All right, you guys, last thing we want to talk about with the cons of living in the city is the freedom aspect. Now, obviously, if you're living in an addition, living in certain neighborhoods, you're going to have covenants and restrictions on what you can and cannot do. I mean, you can't just walk out in your backyard if you're living in an addition and light up a huge bonfire. You can't start shooting a rifle. You can't start shooting a handgun. You can't do certain things that you can do when you're living in the country. Really, generally, a lot less freedom when you're living in the city. You can't walk out your back door and take a piss in the morning. Just simple stuff like that you can't really do when you're living in the city. So if you're someone that values, complete and total freedom, country living is definitely going to be more suited for you, depending on obviously the other factors. But in general, it's just there's going to be a lot more restrictions. There's going to be a lot more nosy neighbors. You're going to be in very close proximity to other homes. You're just going to have to deal with a little bit more restrictions and how you can live your day-to-day life when you have covenant dictating what you can and cannot do, and obviously also having to adhere to what your neighbors say is acceptable or unacceptable, or what they deem acceptable or unacceptable. Alrighty guys, I think that about wraps up today's video. I hope this gave you guys some insight on city living versus country living, and like I mentioned before, guys, it's really gonna depend on your personality and what makes sense for you. I wanted to go over some things that you may or may not have considered before making a decision. It's really just gonna come down to asking yourself, what is important to me, what do I value, and what makes most sense for me. So that's really what it comes down to, guys, and yeah, I think that's about it for today, and as always, I will see you guys in the next video.